the music didn't turn off. I don't know what's going on. It's going to end any second. Maybe not. Well, let me see if I can turn that off. Come on. All right, that's it. Hey, do you produce a scripted or a narrative or story-driven kind of a podcast? Well, hi, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I help creatives and business people in the podcasting industry to cover their legal bases and protect themselves and the things that they create. And this is Legit Podcast Pro, a short weekly show where I offer you legal tips and information and strategies, and I answer your questions so you can grow your podcast like a pro. And here we go. Well, all right. So if you produce a scripted podcast, that is a narrative or a storytelling kind of a show, there are more legal issues that are likely to come up for you than for the unscripted interview talk show kinds of formats. And in today's episode of Legit Podcast Pro, I'm going to highlight a few of those issues and give you some food for thought on how to address them. So let's jump right in. Now, when we get into scripted content, really any kind of a content, but in scripted content in particular, we get into more complexity with something called the chain of title. Now, chain of title is essentially the paper trail that proves that you own all the rights to everything that you're putting into the medium that you're creating. So that means things like underlying rights. Is this material based on some kind of a book or movies or songs or poems or plays? Is it incorporating other stuff that had a life or that was created prior to your creating the story that you're telling in your show? No, you just can't read. You can't just read books into your microphone. Attribution isn't going to do the job. In fact, sometimes attribution saying, this is from so-and-so, sometimes that's a smoking gun. Even paraphrasing or reworking a pre-existing story isn't okay if you're copying protected elements from that material. So you need to secure permission in the form of a license or a letter of permission or something like that if the material is entitled to copyright protection. And that means it's not in the public domain. It's protected under copyright law. So the way copyright law works is that the act of authorship is how you get ownership of something. So unless you are an employee of a company, in which case the company owns the work, you own what you've created as the author. And that's just an important thing to remember. So unless you've created the material, you need to get permission. That's the chain of title, that series of documents that shows, well, so-and-so wrote the underlying short story, and then this person got these rights, and then I got my rights from them, and that's, so it's the chain of title. Very much like if you were buying a piece of real estate, you would record the title with the county clerk's office or the office of property records so that you would be able to trace back to who the original author or creator of the material is. So that's the chain of title on underlying material. The other area where you get into this is when you have a writer or writers working to create the story that you're telling. You have to think about their work as well, because as I said, authorship is ownership. So if you are not hiring them as your employee, you're treating them as independent contractors, then you need to be very clear in the written paperwork. You have to have a written contract with those writers that says you own the work, that it's a, quote, work made for hire, or that they transfer, that is, they assign ownership of the material to you. Now, under copyright law, it is possible for a non-employee to create a work as a work made for hire. That is essentially to belong to the party that's hiring and paying them, but only if it lands in certain categories. If there are certain listed, enumerated kinds of works that can be created as works for hire. And the one that is most close to what we do in podcasting is audio-visual work. But if you don't have a visual component, I have some reservations about whether or not it really is an audio-visual work. So what we do in those situations is we make a contract that says, this is a work made for hire. I'm creating it. It was specially commissioned, and the writer is doing it for hire, essentially. And if for some reason that doesn't work and it doesn't confer ownership, then the writer is also assigning or transferring full ownership to the paying party. That's the usual way. Now, I keep talking about paying party. You got to have some compensation in there. It is not okay to hire people as employees or under any other circumstance without there being some kind of consideration in exchange for the services that they're rendering. The contract depends on that. So there's got to be some kind of consideration, some compensation. Now, it doesn't always have to mean that you're paying them a salary or a weekly wage or an hourly rate or any of those kinds of things. But that would be what we call fixed compensation. Your contract with your writers can also include what we call deferred compensation, saying we will pay you this much money when certain things happen or at a certain point in time. Now, that's only good if that certain point in time is actually going to come to pass. Now, with podcasting, we don't always know if there's going to be a profit generated or revenue at all coming in from the show, but that is one of the kinds of milestones that we look to. There's actually two other kinds of compensation that can change hands. It's called contingent compensation. That is the back end payment, the percentage of something that happens. Maybe it's a percentage of the gross receipts from the show, or maybe it's a percentage of the net profits from the show. And you have to also then articulate how is that calculated, and you got to give the person receiving that contingent back end compensation an opportunity to see the books and make sure that they're being paid accordingly and appropriately and those kinds of things. So as you start to get into pushing off payment longer and farther away or until certain things happen, it gets more and more complex in how you go about actually articulating that. So you got to get this stuff down in writing. Now, the other way that I mentioned that you can compensate a writer or really anybody who's participating in the creation is with equity ownership in the podcast, in the company that's making the podcast or whatever. And again, it needs to be in writing. It needs to be clear. If there's equity ownership, sometimes there are securities laws that need to be considered. So be thoughtful about that. Other things that need to be included in the contract with a creator, if you are not if the creator is not also the owner of the company, is what's the credit for the person who is doing the work? Are they going to receive some kind of credit, and how is that going to be handled? And what if there's a sequel or a remake or a spin-off? Will they get paid again for material that's based on characters and storyline plots and things like that they created in the first instance? So maybe there's other payments, or maybe they get to be along for that ride as well, something like that. So that's the writer's deals. But when you're making scripted stuff, most of the time there are other artists involved in creating it. I'm talking about actors, directors, designers. Sometimes sound designers are big in the podcasting space, of course. And so again, these people need to be considered, and you need to have some sort of documentation. Now, most of the time, folks in these categories are going to look like employees. And we could talk about the difference between employees and independent contractors on another episode. But I just want to make sure, you got to be careful that you're doing this right. And most of the time, under most state laws, not just California's weird one, but many of the others, someone who is showing up at a given place and time to do a certain thing and read from scripts and perform a role and so on, they're going to be an employee. And they may even be members of a union. So you want to make sure you're complying with the appropriate union guidelines. Now, for actors in podcasts, it's going to be SAG-AFTRA. That's the Screen Actors Guild / American Federation of Television and Recording Artists. And that's the organization that you'd need to deal with. And they have lots of different levels and tiers, and too much to go into here, but be sure you're complying if you're using union performers. And most professional performers are members of those unions. Watch out if you're dealing with volunteers, because as I said, it is okay to use volunteers, but it needs to be clearly articulated that's what they're doing. And the scope of what they're doing and the role that they play if they're performing in it and all those things need to be carefully articulated. And the fact that they are not being compensated. And even if you have volunteers who are not being compensated for their work, you still have to cover them with insurance and those kinds of things. So make sure you look out for that. Again, their compensation structure needs to be articulated. You can do fixed compensation or deferred or contingent, or you could share equity with them if you so choose. Lots of those things happen. Another point to think about when you're using casting, talent for a show, is that you sign them up for an exclusive period of time. And if your show is going to have multiple seasons and you're going to have the same actors coming back, you got to make sure they're still available for the next season and the next season and the next season. That may mean paying them some money to hold on to their availability, because if they get cast in something else, well, you might have a problem getting them to be on your little podcast when they're now a big TV or film star. So those are the kinds of things you want to be at least thinking and asking the questions about. Make sure you have them available. Maybe it's on a best efforts or a reasonable professional availability kind of a basis, or something like that. But yeah, just make sure you're considering all these things. So the other things, other people that are working on your show, you've got a crew. You probably got an engineer, recording person. You probably got sound effects people. Much of that may be done in post. The editor and any producers that you have working, researchers, those kinds of things, got to have written agreements for them as well that articulate the job scope. What's their compensation? How will they receive credit? What is expected of them and what is expected of you? How will they get paid? Those kinds of things. Next thing you need to think about with scripted material is script clearance. This is the process of making sure that there's nothing in the script that's going to come back and bite you on the butt. Because if you can go into the business of producing the thing and then you find out, well, it's kind of too late and you're going to spend a lot of money and energy to undo it. Things like character names. What if you have a character in your story who is portrayed as, I don't know, maybe you've got a character who's a dentist who's accused of child molestation. Well, and they live in, I don't know, Phoenix, Arizona or something like that. Well, what if that character's name is Stephen Andrews, and you then make your show and it turns out there's a real dentist in Phoenix, Arizona named Stephen Andrews. Even though your thing is fiction, it's narrative fiction, that Stephen Andrews might have the basis for some kind of a claim that you have defamed him or caused some kind of harm to his reputation and things like that. So you've got to have a research report done on the scripts to make sure that those kinds of things aren't happening. You got to watch out for defamation. You have to watch out for invasions of privacy, especially if you're telling stories about real people. And if you're mentioning things like brands or portraying brands in your show, talking about, I don't know, a particular brand of cheesecake or something like that, you've got to get that cleared and make sure that you're not going to be causing them some kind of reputational harm or other kind of injury to reputation or anything like that. So again, be careful. Next up, we have to think about how are you financing your scripted piece. Now, scripted storytelling often takes more money than those simpler show formats like interviews and one-offs and talk show formats and things like that. You've got to pay the personnel. You got to pay for rights. You've got equipment and facilities and production and editing. My guess is that a typical scripted show probably costs 5 to 10 times what it costs to make a single episode on a per episode basis, a single episode of an unscripted show. But your mileage may vary. And if you're dealing with stars and big celebrities, even more than that. So you got to ask, how are you going to fund this? One way is the out-of-pocket. You could fund it with your own funds. Maybe you've got a company that's got some coffers to reach into, and that's fine. That's great. That's pretty easy. But if you want to get investors to finance the production of the series of episodes or something like that, well, bringing in investors adds a real layer of complexity because you've got to comply with securities regulations. It isn't as simple as getting, hey, you want to give me a few $1,000 and I'll give you a piece of the company. You got to jump through some hoops and comply with the law. Anytime you're offering passive securities, passive investment opportunities, those are securities transactions that need to be registered with the SEC or under some exemption, and you'll need to make sure you understand how that works. Or you could do debt financing where you borrow the money to make your show and then pay it back from revenues that are going to come in later. Again, that's a deal, a promissory note with a bank or a lender of some sort. Make sure you're getting that right. So if you're doing any of these more complex formats, it is really, really important that you consider all of the legal and business aspects of what you're doing. The movie business has been doing these kinds of things for a bit more than a century now, and the same best practices and protocols that the movie industry uses apply to narrative storytelling in the podcast format. So don't just wing it. That is a recipe for real trouble. Get some advice. Now, I personally have been helping folks in film, television, live theater, and podcasting throughout my entire professional career, over 30 years now. So reach out to me with your questions or get some advice from someone like me. Now, if you don't mind, I want to invite you to a special workshop that I'm going to be doing. It is, look, you pay attention to the quality of your sound, right? You pay attention. You want to sound as good as possible and as professional as possible. And let's face it, you probably spent some cash getting it that way, didn't you? You focus your energy on what's inside your show, the content. You're all about delivering top shelf, professional grade content. And maybe you even pay careful attention to your numbers because, hey, you got to have an audience if you're going to have an impact, right? So it stands to reason you want to take the most professional approach to everything about your podcast, even if the goal for you and your podcast isn't to make money. So why would you leave the back office stuff to chance? Well, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I'm here to tell you how important it is to get your business and legal affairs in order. You got to do this stuff. You see, professionalism is about more than sound quality. It's about more than top grade content. It's about more than knowing your numbers. It's about getting all the back office stuff handled so you can be more confident, more risk tolerant, and you can play the big, bold game, do the things that drive success. And I want to show you how easily you can do that to get legit and go pro with your podcast. I want to show you how fast and easy it is to do it yourself if you're so inclined. You don't need to hire a lawyer, and you don't have to spend a fortune to do it either. But you will sleep better at night knowing that you've got your I's dotted and your T's crossed, and that you and your podcast and your business are protected. I've got a free live online workshop called Business and Legal Fundamentals for Podcast Growth and Success. There's the banner or poster for it. Business and Legal Fundamentals for Podcast Growth and Success. It's happening on Tuesday, August 16th at 9 a.m. Pacific. And you can sign up right now, register. It's free, and I want you to be there. So please register. This is part of my goal to help 10,000 podcasters. It's the product of my more than 30 years advising creative business owners, seeing what they need and what they don't, what works and what's a waste of energy, helping them make and distribute and profit from their films and TV shows and podcasts. And in this workshop, you will discover the 3 traits that professionals have that most hobbyists don't. I'm going to share with you 4 key strategies that will ensure stability and security in your business so you can build a lasting, successful, growing, profitable podcast with confidence. I'm going to show you why and how getting your business and legal affairs in order will streamline your operations and supercharge your podcast growth. And I'll show you the easy way to structure things so you can grow your show and have that lasting impact and make good money with your podcast if that's what you're out to do. Because it really is time to hang up your amateur status, whether your podcast is a hobby or a side hustle or your full-time gig. Isn't it time to go pro? Registration is at podcastlaw.net, so head over there right now, register, and join me on August 16th for Business and Legal Fundamentals for Podcast Growth and Profit. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and that is about it for this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. This episode is brought to you, of course, by the free Legit Podcast Pro community, where we help each other to grow and prosper with our podcasting ventures. You can join that now by going to legitpodcastpro.com. But this time I want you to just focus on registering for the workshop. It's coming up on August 16th at 9 a.m. in the morning Pacific time. There it is one more time. And you can register now by going to podcastlaw.net. Thanks for being here with me today, and I'll see you again next Thursday with another episode of Legit Podcast Pro. Have a great day.